This continues an interview with George Massey on August 1st, 2003 in Knoxville, Tennessee with Kurt Peeler and
Bob Gracia.
And you were saying you worked in the alumni mailing room.
Worked in the alumni mailing room. At that time it was in the bottom of Science Hall, and then through the years it ended up, they actually named the building for Marion Longhorn down there off of, I don't know the streets anymore, but it's down on the back side of the campus, where they in fact had finally moved the printing and mailing section. So, but anyway, got that job. My wife got a job at Rich's, working in the department store, and so we settled into married life. But this apartment that we rented was a basement apartment, basically one room, had a little kitchen area, and a little bathroom, just basic stuff. And of course, school started then. The quarter started in September. So we'd gotten moved in, started to school, and then it started getting a little cool. And I remember thinking to myself, I said, I don't see any heating. Of course, we didn't have air conditioning back. Of course, it was a basement apartment, so it was kind of cool. I mean, it was, rather cool. So when it finally turned off cold, they turned the cranked up the furnace, which was downstairs in this big apartment type building. And that's when we found out what our heat was. There were two pipes running through the ceiling, bare pipes that ran to the other parts of the house. That was our heat. No way to control. I mean, it was just like you were in an oven. And the first night they cranked those up, it was wow. I mean, we literally were in the nude almost.
Because you were it was like summer.
Oh, it was so hot. And this was probably the end of September, 1st of October, when it started getting cooler. And at that point, having been married probably a month and a half, my wife looked at me and says, "We're moving, or I'm going home." So we went out and got us a little apartment up on Highland at that point. Nice little two-bedroom apartment, or two-room, bedroom, or kitchen, bedroom, living room, bedroom, kitchen, bath. It was just shotgun.
Yeah.
And moved in with this older couple that lived upstairs, and they had two apartments downstairs. And that was a heck of a lot better living conditions. They had a little heater type thing. But anyhow, and across the hall was a graduate student, Nancy and Garrett Yanagi. He was here getting his doctorate degree in psychology. To this day, we still correspond.
Really?
They're back in Hawaii. They were from Hawaii.
They were from Hawaii.
Yeah.
And you've maintained that relation.
We've maintained it. We've fortunately been able to go to Hawaii 3 or 4 times, or more than that, I guess. I went during Vietnam, and then we've been back over there. The latest time was 2 summers ago. And we see them every time we go. Maintain contact with them. But they had a little daughter, and of course he was in psychology. He was majoring in psychology, getting his doctorate. And so they kind of took us under their wings. I mean, they were a little older because he was already in grad school. So we, had a real good relationship with them. And one story I will tell, unfortunately, our landlady, Miss Brown, passed away. And we didn't know this, but her husband was an alcoholic. I'd been around alcoholics. I'd worked on pipelines and stuff like that when I was in high school and construction work, and I'd seen alcoholics, but I never knew he was. And he was a sign painter. They talk about sign painters a lot of times have that propensity to drink a lot. But anyway, when she passed away, he just went off the deep end. He had a son living here in Knoxville that would come over, and we had met him. And then all of a sudden, at night, we get these knocks on the door from Mr. Brown, just, drunk as a skunk, wanting to borrow money to go get beer. Well, I wouldn't. I said, I'd learned this early on. You don't give an alcoholic money, or you don't go buy some booze for him. And I just tell him, I said, Mr. Brown, I'm a poor college student. I don't have, money to give you. And I just he'd go across the hallway and he'd knock on the Yanagi's door, Garrett. And I'd hear this conversation. This will be the last 6-pack I won't drink anymore. You buy me a six, but give me the money. I won't drink anymore. Well, Garrett, you give him the money. Well, this went on, I guess, for a week maybe. Finally, one Saturday, I said, Garrett, let me tell you something. I said, Mr. Brown, unfortunately, is an alcoholic. And I said, he will continue to drink as long as he can get beer, whiskey, whatever. And I said, you, because I'm sitting here thinking, he's a psychologist, you know, whatever. I said, you don't need to be giving him. I said, and just tell him you don't have the money to give it to him. You got to refuse him. Because I said, these alcoholics, you know, that's what they're doing. So we've laughed about that through the years. He said, here you were a young kid that was able to tell me the psychology of an alcoholic. So anyhow, so we had, you know, started, and we had friends who were up here in school, and there were one or two married couples that we knew. So we kind of piled around with them, and then we started going to the Church Street Methodist Church up there, where my mother and dad had married. And they had a youth group there, which was all college students and married. It was a married class.
Mm-hmm.
This afternoon, one of those couples that we met in this Sunday school class is coming to visit us. And another one of the couples, we get together periodically. All three
Mm-hmm.
couples get together, and we went to Hawaii together.
Mm-hmm.
We call ourselves the Big Chill Group, or Big Chill Bunch, actually. So we maintained, you know, those relationships for 45 years. But, and, you know, around home, as we say, when a couple ran off and got married, like we did, you know, after 6 or 7 months, they'd have the first child. And that's kind of what they would think. Well, that was not our situation. We just got married, and I was out of college and already on active duty before we had our first child.
Mm-hmm. If you don't mind me asking, was that by design, or was that just the way it worked out?
No, we kind of said, hey, you know, and about the only guidance, I guess you'd say, that my mother gave me, she said, you know, you have taken a lot of responsibility, and one of the things that you really need to be aware of is having children. She said, that's a big responsibility. And then my middle brother also kind of talked to me about that. He said,
You don't need a child.
You've bitten off a lot here, so you better make sure, you know, you kind of think about it. So, you know, we did.
Mm-hmm.
It worked out. Then I got on active duty and got established in my career, quote, in the military. And, had medical benefits and all that. So our first day.
Now, I had asked you, you know, how you'd originally started a business, and how did getting married affect?
Well, I kind of digressed there and got off on a
No, it's a great story. So
there. Well, like I say, I said, well, I'm gonna major in business. Started football. That didn't, you know, like I say, it just didn't work out. I'd hurt a knee in high school, but then I hurt my shoulder. You know, as a walk-on, I mean, you're cannon fodder, and I figured that out early on, too. Although I knew some of the guys who were here on scholarship. And, so I had good friends there, maintained, you know, with them all through school. But in any event, so I had to start working. You know, Dad, you know, when we got married, Randolph got married, he said, well, you're going to have to start working. So I took the first quarter of business, which was just basic courses. I took English, you know, what they call it. There's a term they use for it. It is a basic course.
General education, yeah.
And I had taken a phys ed class and got down to phys ed department, because that's where a lot of the football players were, guys that I knew. And I met Dr. Plotnicki, and although I called him Dr. Venable, you know, the newspaper columnist,
Mm-hmm.
Sam Venable was his dad. He was not a doctor. Now, he was a phys ed instructor
Mm-hmm.
at the university. And everybody called him Dr. Sam. But in any event, kind of got into that, and for whatever reason, said, well, I'll get into education. And I may coach. At this point, I thought about, you know, I always liked it. I said, well, maybe I'll coach. I'll be a teacher and I'll coach. And started looking around for a quote, second major, if you will, or a minor in history. I'd always liked reading and historical things. And I had one of my teachers in grade school, Miss Lucy Crawford. And I don't know if and of course we always had magazines, books, and everything in our house. Reading was a big thing that you did. And so I got with this Miss Lucy Crawford, who was my 5th and 6th grade teacher. And she kind of got me off into reading historical biographies of all the famous Americans. So it just kind of, and I still do that today. And so I got into history. So I minored in history and majored in phys ed. And then, of course, by the time I got involved in the ROTC, then that became my major.
Yeah.
I mean,
So when you didn't just drift into advanced ROTC. That was a very conscious decision.
Yeah, once the sophomore year, then I really kind of got into it, and the instructors we had here then were a real dynamic group, and I remember, of course, he's still living in Kaplan Lazelle. He made general, as a matter of fact, and I ran into him in Vietnam. He was back then Lower Hudson Field, where the baseball stadium is now. Of course, you're not familiar with it. I keep thinking UTC, but anyway, Lower Hudson at that time was the parade field for Army ROTC, and then the Upper Hudson was for Air Force. Army ROTC, we had 2,500.
Yeah, if all the males have to be, yeah.
It covered, I mean, you fell in, it was a big organization, a brigade. And we were down there, and you had your Thursday afternoon drill, and you had inspections, and then we went out and did dismounted drill or whatever during drill period for 2 hours. Learn how to march, and all that stuff. And we'd do some weapon stuff. But in any event, I remember Captain Lazelle came up in front of me one day, and I'm all standing up in shoes shining and everything, my brass shine on and stuff. And he just, he said, "You're the sharpest looking cadet." I mean, he really, gave me a attaboy type thing. I'm saying, pretty good. So when the end of the sophomore year, they put out a letter, and actually you were invited. It was about a matter that you just automatically went into advanced ROTC.
People were invited to.
Yeah, they were invited to it. So I got that letter, and I said, okay, I think I'll go in and advanced ROTC. And then when I came back to school or started to school that fall, they had to do the cadet chain of command. Had the hierarchy there, if you will. And, Captain Lazelle called me into his office, and he said, "You're going to be," this was my junior year, he said, "You're going to be the brigade sergeant major." Because I had good grades, and I guess it impressed somebody. I don't know. I wasn't doing it out of, I just doing what I thought was right. And he said, "You're going to be the brigade sergeant major for the ROTC department." Because the juniors were the NCOs, and the seniors were the officers, at that point. So, okay, I was in kind of high, rarefied air, being the brigade sergeant major, command sergeant major at that point. So, in any event, that rolled along, and then, between the junior and senior year, you went to the summer camp, what they call the advanced camp. We down in Fort Benning, Georgia. And at the end of the school year, they'd call me in and say, "Hey, unless you just go down to summer camp and fall all over yourself, you're going to be the brigade commander next year." Golly. And again, it wasn't a design, it wasn't anything I was shooting for.
Yeah.
I didn't politic for it or anything like that. So went to summer camp, did okay.
Where did you go to summer camp?
Fort Benning, Georgia. Home of the infantry. Queen of Battle. I'm an infantry officer. So.
Yeah, I just remember reading that in your book, how you got in charge of doing drill and taking them on their marches and their runs and everything. So.
Yeah, but that was one of the things. The ROTC department here at UT, they prepared us as well as you could for an ROTC program. But I mean, when I literally graduated. Our graduation was on a Sunday afternoon, June, whatever it was. Tuesday morning, my wife and I left here, and we drove straight to Fort Benning because I had orders to report Tuesday morning, Fort Benning, Georgia, to the 2nd Infantry Division. I wasn't going to the schools. They brought me right.
Right, you were right into.
Right to a unit.
You were like the young second lieutenant with no.
Youngs didn't know, kind of old as they say. But so Tuesday we got into Benning, reported in, and the next Wednesday morning went out to my company, A Company, the 38th Infantry, and met my executive officer, young. He was, I said, first lieutenant. He was old, but he black first lieutenant. So this was other than summer camp, because we had blacks there from Florida A&M, and some of the schools, the black schools. That was the first black officer that I'd ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
He was about this tall and mean as a bulldog. And he grabbed me if I walked in, and he started chewing on me when I walked in the door. And he said, "Lieutenant, tomorrow morning, it wasn't will you, can you, or, tomorrow morning, you give PT. You're in charge of PT in the morning." Okay. And we did what was called the Army Daily Dozen back then. Went on runs. Well, I knew that, in my sleep I could do it, because we had done it so much here at UT. So the next morning, we fall in for PT. And Lieutenant Randall.
That was your
That was his XO, Lieutenant Randall, Marshal Randall. I called him Randy.
Once you got
Well, yeah,
so
not for a while, but
no. So some of this was the sort of getting you, the toughness did not.
Yeah. Well, I didn't call him Randy till I was the first lieutenant. He was too. He was always Lieutenant Randall.
So he.
But he said, "Lieutenant Massey, front center." Of course, the troops didn't know who I was. I had met my platoon sergeant and had seen the platoon bay, but I really hadn't met my troops, my platoon. And so we go out. He's at front and center, so I go out in front of the formation. So he says, "You're in charge of PT." And I did an about face and went through the open ranks march, and all that stuff, and get them going. And then, it was a story I tell in the book. I took them on a run. I said, "That's what we're supposed to do. That's what we did up here. Once you got through the daily dozen, you went on a little run." I fell them back in, right face forward march, double time march, and we go and start singing cadence. And of course, went by the brigade headquarters and sang, on the left sick call, and made a few comments like that. By the time we got back to the company, I guess somebody had called, and of course I fell them out, and dismissed them. And old Randy started chewing on me. Of course, I can't say it on the tape what he said to me. And then when it was all over, he chewed me pretty hard. And when it was all over, he said, "That's a damn good show, Lieutenant." I mean, he kind of had to chew my butt out, but then at the same time, he understood that, hey, we got Lieutenant here with some tea and vinegar, so we got along well there. Sure did. But my first platoon sergeant, when I met him that first afternoon, whenever I got in there, he said, "Well, sir, let's go down to mess hall and get a cup of coffee." Well, I don't drink coffee. And I said, "Well, Sergeant Poole." I said, "Sergeant Poole, I don't drink coffee." He stopped. "Sir, you'll never make it in this man's army." I said, "Well, I'll try." We kept in contact, and Sergeant Poole died 2 years ago.
So you stayed in touch and he was career Army. No, that's fine. And well, before we continue the Army, because I know we're gonna be on the recorded bit, I want to just back up a little more to UT.
Okay.
And one thing I wanted to ask about UT and ROTC is because I've done a lot of interviews, particularly with people in the 40s and 50s. Everyone was in ROTC for the first 2 years. But it's something that, except in places like VMI and a few other sort of the Citadel, you no longer have situations where, like, the whole freshman class is in ROTC. And shortly after you leave college, I mean, it's in the 60s that this starts to fade out. What were sort of, now stepping back from a career, looking at it as a career Army, you're
Yeah.
as a regular. What were the benefits and what were the limitations of, say, the whole freshman class being in ROTC, the whole sophomore class?
It's an interesting question. I, of course, compared, later on I became a professor of military science.
Yeah.
I had an ROTC program.
Yeah.
Out in Washington State.
Which was very different because then it wasn't the whole.
The thing that with the large group like that, you could do a whole lot more.
Mm-hmm.
And
Like, what could you do that you can't do when you have the small groups?
well, more particularly in the advanced course, we had field maneuvers. I mean, we did, and you were able to, I guess, if you will, lead larger units. Back then you had as a company commander in the brigade, you had a full company of troops out there in front of you. 3 or 4 platoons, and of course, like as a brigade commander, I had all this hierarchy down under me. Had a full staff, and I think you really got a better feel for what the military organization is. But as far as having what the effect being large as opposed to small, I guess it became a little more competitive. And at the time, though, I didn't realize I was in competition.
Yeah.
I just came in and did what I thought was right and tried to keep my nose clean and my brash polished and all that. And then you were selected. Now they're begging you to go in.
Yeah, I mean, I've been struck by that.
That's the big flip I see.
Well, another question is because you were saying that you didn't enter college with the notion I'm going to be already. You said, in fact, you were going to be a coach. And do you think if you had been required to take ROTC, what are and it's always hard to speculate, but do you think you would you have joined ROTC if you hadn't been required to take it initially?
Probably not.
Yeah. That it was very significant that you had, and you did well at it. And
well, of course, I don't know if I liked the structure or I just kind of got and back then and still I think they still do to a degree. A lot of the things we did were a hands-on physical type thing, more particularly in the advanced course back then.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you taught classes and you gave dismounted drill and you instructed people how to do this, that, and the other. The physical training, our physical training program, this Captain Lazelle I referred to earlier on, he was a VMI graduate, and a little short and stocky. I mean, you had to be physically fit, or else.
Yeah.
So, but later on, it came back to pay tremendous benefit to me. In that, like I say, the second day with the unit, I had to give conduct the PT formation for the company.
And that.
Had I not known, it'd been brutal. And there was no question, like I say, you have PT tomorrow morning. So from that viewpoint, that just kind of appealed to me. Of course, I'd played sports and I was always into physical things. And we did a lot of that in the ROTC program. But whether or not I might have gone into ROTC, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's something about hypothetical, and there was no option.
Yeah, there was no option, so I don't know if I would have or not. And once I got into, saying, well, I'm going to be a coach and be the physical ed. Even when I went on active duty, I was not sure that I was going to stay for a career.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I said, I'll get out and maybe go back and teach and coach and do all that. I had my certificate and all that. And so when I got on active duty then, the unit I got with was the 2nd Infantry Division. Did a lot of field work. I mean, we were going just, my first tour of duty was, quote, a stateside tour, as they say, non-hardship tour. Well, I was gone from home 9 months out of that first year. I mean, literally away from Fort Benning. So, now, a big chunk of that was 6 months to Europe on a plan called Rotoplan, which they swapped battle groups at that time. But we were out in the woods. We were out in the field. I mean, we were training hard because we were a, quote, STRAC unit. It was one of the strategic...
So you were not a garrison?
Not a garrison troop at all. And back then, unlike now with the brigades or the regiments, the chainsaws are not the companies, they'll go out and do their training for a 6-week period, and in 6 weeks they're garrison duty. They do the police call and they paint the billets and all that. Back then, the Army was structured a whole lot and it had a whole lot more civilian support. We trained. We didn't fool with taking care of the village or doing the police call. I mean, we did the basic stuff we had to do around the company area. But as far as doing it for the post, what they call post detail now, that was, we trained, we went to the woods. And then, of course, involved during that same time, I was able to go to the jump school, learn how to be a paratrooper. That was one of the things my mother chastised me. She said, I have raised a complete idiot that will jump out of a perfectly, you heard the old story, jump out of a perfectly good aircraft. What were you thinking? I said, it's a lot of fun. She said, okay, whatever. But, so like I say, I went to the unit first after getting on active duty. And then a month or two later, I finally went to the basic course. And then right out of the basic course, I was on orders for jump school. And then I was on orders for Ranger School. And our unit got tabbed to go to Europe for 6 months, so I got pulled off of the Ranger School orders. So we went to Germany for 6 months without families. And, you had to really, back then, families couldn't, and we weren't on post anyway. Lieutenant, I didn't qualify for post housing. So we were in a little apartment outside Benning, so she had to come home. And just kind of uprooted her for 6 months. She stayed with her parents.
Until
I got back to Benning, and then I got back to Benning, and we basically set our duffel bags down, and 2 weeks later, I was on orders to Ranger School. So I left Benning again, and she was sitting in an apartment for 9 weeks while I was in Ranger School. And then we get back from there, and we go to the woods again for Swift Strike and all these big training exercises. So the wives back then had to really kind of fend for themselves, and there was a cohesiveness, and not many of the wives worked.
Mm-hmm.
Very few of the active duty.
Your wife didn't?
She did not work in a, quote, job per se. Now, they had the thrift shop. The wives kind of ran. They had the Red Cross stuff that she helped with. But as far as going out and working in a department store like she had done while I was in school, or she ended up working in Dr. Milton's office over here at UT in the psychology department. She was kind of secretary type. But a lot of the wives did not work and started having children.
Mm-hmm.
That was, they were stay-at-home moms, so to speak. That changed as the years went on. By the time I reached a major lieutenant colonel, you had your captains and lieutenants. A majority of the wives worked.
Mm-hmm.
And so the whole fabric of the military family community kind of got dissipated a little bit. Because the wives' clubs, they'd go to the teas and they'd put on the hats and the gloves. I mean, it was there was some real tradition there that they did earlier on in the 60s. Vietnam contributed to that too, because that kind of blew everything out of the water, because there was so much turbulence, reassignments and turnover, and people going to schools and then back to Vietnam, and units didn't have that same, you didn't stay in the same unit for 3 years.
Mm-hmm. Like you did with the Army you came in, this was your unit.
This was your family, so to speak.
Yeah.
The captains took care of the lieutenants, and the colonels took care of the captains, that type of thing. And the colonel's wife, although we never did, and this is, my wife and I have talked about this a time or two, we never met a colonel's wife who wore the rank. You know what I'm saying? She was the colonel's wife, but she took care of her girls. But she never, lorded it over them that I'm the colonel's wife and you got to bounce straight to me. We were fortunate that we never ran in. Now,
because that pattern did exist.
There were bunch of them around, and the general's wife. A lot of times you'd run into some generals' wives who were
the general wives.
But again, as far as the actual unit I was assigned to, we never ran into one of those, and we felt fortunate, but we know of people that did, and we knew of others that were like that. And that happens.
I wanted to just make sure I ask a few more UT
Okay, yeah,
questions.
jump ahead.
No. This is all great. You really did want to play football. It sounds like that, that was.
That was. But I found, and I understood earlier on, I probably could have continued.
Yeah.
But as I say, I took on responsibility, and I basically was told, "Hey, you got to get on with it." And football was
something that had to go.
Yeah.
Who was the coach here that when you?
Coach Bowden White was the head coach. Johnny Majors was the freshman coach at that point. He was here as a graduate assistant. Golly, I'm trying to think of some of his. Ralph Chansey was here as one of the coaches. Beetle Bailey, he was the line coach. And Beetle Bailey, Coach Bailey, was probably 5'5". And he literally, of course, back then we didn't have all the big face masks they have now. We had a single bar, or maybe they finally came out with a double bar, but it wasn't like they've got now. And he'd have to reach up and grab these big tackles and pull them down to his eye level to chew them out. But Bowden White, Coach White was the head coach. And see, at that point, General Nayland, I call him Nayland, it ain't dealing to me, General Nayland was still the athletic director.
Oh, wow.
When I came here in '58.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then I guess he retired. I can't remember when he passed away, but yeah, he was still here as athletic director. And Coach White was the head coach. And we played, and this is interesting, at that time Tennessee was one of the few schools remaining that played the single wing, the old single wing offense. That probably didn't make a bit of sense to you, but it's you basically had a tailback, a fullback, a blocking back, and a wing back. That was, if you can get the relationship, the tailback was right here, fullback here, blocking back, wing back. Well, I had played single wing high school football in high school, and I played pulling guard at 155 pounds. Well, when I came up here at about 160 pounds, although the linemen were not that big back then, 190 pound, 200 pound lineman was a big, pretty good sized guy. And you'd have some that maybe 220, maybe 6'3", 6'4", but nothing like today. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So, and I had a little speed, although I had a knee operation by this time, so I still had pretty good speed. And we were all white. We didn't, So anyway, they put me out at wing back. And a little war story here. The first scrimmage we had after we started the fall, two-a-days. Everybody get your pads on. We're going to scrimmage this afternoon. Of course, we were all looking forward to having to hit somebody, other than blocking them. And so they threw me out there at wing back, and I came down, and and of course, very basic plays. All those single wing plays are pretty well the same all over, And I knew a little bit about what a wing back's supposed to do, although I played guard. And one of the things you do, you come down and block on a linebacker. Well, I came down the line. Of course, and as a guard, I'd always use my forearm. I mean, of course, back then you had to hold in and block this way. You couldn't push out. And all
you couldn't put,
you had to hold in. You couldn't do like they do today, or couldn't you? But I used my forearms a lot in high school. I popped somebody in the side of the head with a forearm. But back then we didn't have the face mask. I mean, you could get to somebody pretty good. Well, anyway, I came down the line. This linebacker turned around. Boom! I hit him, knocked his nose, and blood. And Coach Proctor was the freshman. He was the freshman coach, and Coach Major, Johnny Majors, and Bronson, Tommy Bronson, who had played ball here. They were the assistants or graduate assistants, whatever. But I popped him and started bleeding. Old Proctor, he just, we got blood, that was that go get 'em type mentality type thing, But of course, payback's hell, as they say. So, but it was interesting, and like I say, I did hurt a shoulder, and old Mickey O'Brien, we called him Mother O'Brien, was the trainer then. I don't know if you know any of the Tennessee history, but I mean, he's revered as trainers go. He was here for years. And You know, he kind of looked at it, well, son, you know, they were kind of rough and gruff back then, because they didn't do a lot of, you didn't get sympathy much, you know, when you went in hurt, so. But in any event, then, like I say, I went off on a weekend. They gave us the weekend off or something, got married and came back, and that kind of ended it up. So.
That ended your. Though it sounds like you were an avid fan of as a student. That was one of the things.
Oh yeah.
Regularly.
Well, see, back then, you got your football tickets with your student activity card, and you got a pack of football tickets. And they had the student section over there somewhere similar like it is now. And of course, not near as big. The stadium wasn't near as big. But all the games were afternoon games. It didn't have any lighting, you know, and TV, golly, I don't even know if they televised it. You know. So your games started at 1 o'clock. And back then we had classes 6 days a week under the quarter system. Well, working the way I was, I took all morning classes. I mean, I don't know that I did not have an 8 o'clock class every day of the week while I was in school.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in summer, I went to summer school as well. Maybe in summer school I might have had a 10 o'clock class. Mm-hmm. But every day, 6 days a week, I had an 8 o'clock class. And I'd get out by noon, so I worked in the afternoons. And so Saturday morning, although classes stopped at noon on Saturday, but you had Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday classes in the mornings. So we'd jump out and go over here and get in line and go to football games. I mean, that was a big treat for us, and you could get a spouse ticket. My wife, of course, got her ticket. We'd go together. And you know, like it is today, you know, you weren't supposed to drink, and of course we would, you know, hide our booze, a little half pint, you know, in our pants, and go in, and you know, and you had that going on. And of course, I was not a fraternity guy. But I had a lot of friends, you know,
who had been
primarily from ROTC that were fraternity guys. So, you know, they'd have their little groups, and hey, come on. So we kind of were independents, but we got invited to a lot of the fraternity parties and stuff going on. And we knew a lot of the football players too. You know, so we kind of had a good little group that we ran around with. But then, like I say, I worked in the alumni mailing room all through school. Up until my last year, I started working at the Tennessee, at that time, the ag campus or the ag school, had a dairy, you know, ongoing dairy, made cheese and butter and milk and all that stuff.
And so you worked there?
So I worked there I delivered to all the campus, you know, like Sophonia Strong Cafeteria, and at that time, the University Center had just started,
the cafeteria.
The Carolyn Brown Center down here, and delivered to the UT hospital, the nurses' quarter. Interesting tale or two there, but you know, you go on the floor. I had this little cart, you know, like, man on the floor, because all student nurses, female student nurses, and they had a community kitchen, and I'd go in and restock with the milk. And orange juice.
But you'd hear the shouts. You would be greeted, man on the floor.
Well, I was supposed to shout that. And I didn't shout it real loud, you know. Man on the floor, man on the floor. But they could hear my cart coming, and you know, it was interesting. And most of them, they would be in their pajamas and robes and stuff like that. Because I went in there early in the morning. But the first, and this digressing again, but when the first day I started my deliveries out here, you know, they give you a ticket, and you say, okay, I got 5 cases of this going there, each delivery schedule, and they show you what goes where, and they load this up in a reverse order. I mean, it was done pretty well. So and you pick up the empties, you know, so I'm doing all this stuff and swapping it around, down the delivery truck with a metal floor to it, one of these old type delivery trucks. So I get through, and I've got this about a half case of 4 or 5 chocolate milks, 2 or 3 sweet milks, and 2 or 3 orange juices. I'm looking at it, I said, man, where's this go? I don't see where this goes. So I drive back into to unload my empties over at the UT dairy, and I run this back up through there, and I go inside to total up, show them, you know, get my ticket in, and the guy that loaded me out says, what the hell? So this is yours. So what they would do every day, they would load about a half a case of milk for me.
For you?
Yeah, that was it. He said, hey.
That's like your bonus.
That's your little, yeah. And so the first day I thought, well, this is part of the order I missed somewhere. And the guy said, oh no. I said, that's yours. So boy, from that day forward, I'd drive along drinking milk, and I'd take some of it, and they said, hey, you can do whatever you want to with it. Take it home or whatever. So I'd take some home. And I did get fat as a 10-yard dog, as they say, because this was chocolate milk, and the sweet milk was full fat. I mean, it wasn't 2% or skim or anything like that. So anyhow, that was part of that experience. But I did that my last year in school.
You mentioned before we started the interview some of your professors, like Ruth Stevens, who's come up in quite a bit in interviews. Any remembrances of her?
She was a very opinionated, should I say, and very dynamic. I mean, she wanted you to speak up like you had a say. I guess she probably would tell you that if you didn't speak up. But and Dr. Hoffman he was the European history, and Dr. Hoffman would come in and he'd start writing on the board and start lecturing, and he could just go. and all of them I remember were, and of course maybe it's because I liked history, but they were all very just interesting, and they brought in extra, they really, of course they'd been teaching forever, so they had their script, so to speak, but they were very interesting. I didn't have any that I just, I got to go to his class and something like that. And Dr. Graff, G-R-A.
Oh yes, Leroy Graff.
Leroy Graff.
Yes, I've heard quite a bit. A lot of my colleagues have talked about him. I never knew.
I enjoyed his classes. As a matter of fact, I wrote back to him, or I had to get a letter of reference, and I forget exactly what it was. I know what it was for, as a matter of fact. One of the programs we had in the military, and I don't know if I'm sure they still have it, I don't know if it's called the same thing, it's called ADPRID, Advanced Degree Program for something. I forget what the acronym means. But I went to Vanderbilt. That's where I did my graduate degree. And it was in history department. And they wanted some references. And I got in touch with Dr. Graff because he was one of the few ones left at that point. This was in early 70s. And I remember calling him first, and I kind of introduced myself, and I knew he didn't, remember who I was, and that's understandable. But I told him the time frame I was here, and I had taken this course, and I go, oh yeah, okay, yeah. And I'd be more than happy to write. So he wrote me a quote recommendation to the history department at Vanderbilt, and I of course appreciated that. And Dr. Hoffman, I think, had already. Well, in any event, but Dr. Stevens had already, I think, passed away. But yeah, she was.
When you decided to get a master's in history as part of the Army's program, it sounds like you really did enjoy history as a minor.
Yeah, and what this program was, you would select a series of universities. Of course, I put down Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia, and there was an ulterior reason there. They played good football. I said, if I'm going to go back to grad school, number one, I want to be in the South, and I was, I wanted to be at UT if I could, or Georgia or Alabama. I thought, and I said those would be three good schools to go to because they play good football. Well, I get this letter back from the Department of Army, and of course it's based, quote, on the needs of the military. And what you did, you would go get your master's, and then you stayed there as an ROTC instructor 2 to 3 years after you completed your master's program. And at that point, there were no openings at the 3 schools that I put down, and there was one at Vanderbilt. And so I called the Department of Army, and I said, gentlemen, the guy I was talking to, some lieutenant colonel up there, I was a major at the time. I said, I don't know if I can get into Vanderbilt. I said, I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer, and my undergraduate record is not all that great. I just barely eked out a B average, And I said, I don't know if Vanderbilt will let me in or not. Oh, yeah, no problem. So they contacted me. Well, I go over to Vanderbilt for an interview with them. They're admissions people and everything. And they looked at my undergraduate record and what I'd taken, what courses I'd taken and everything. And they said, well, says you're going to have to take. So you're going to have to take an additional 6 hours. The normal was 24 hours. You need 30 hours to kind of round you out a little bit. It's okay. And you're going to do a thesis. You like to select a thesis. And of course, when I talked to the ROTC department guy, you kind of sign into them, and then you're assigned to them, but you're a student. And they had people in various and sundry stages there at Vanderbilt anyway doing that. And he said, well, you're going to be the military history instructor in the ROTC department when you get to us. And I said, well, yeah, okay, that'd be great. So I looked at the courses that they had, in the Vanderbilt history department. So I kind of weighted myself toward the, quote, the military, although they did not have, and this is interesting, they did not have a military history course per se. But there was a Dr. Fleming who was there who had taught, and I'm trying to remember he had written a book or two on naval history. So I knew he was military oriented. There was a Dr. Borman who was there, who was primarily Far Eastern, China, Japan, and that area. He was a Navy guy, but had always liked the Marines. And so he had done, when you walk in his office, he had this big Marine Corps poster and Semper Fi and all that, of course, that's great, So I kind of said, well, I'm going to gravitate. So in any event, I majored in history with the idea that, and ultimately, I did stay there at Vanderbilt and teach military history. Well, that was the only military history course on campus at Vanderbilt. Well, prior to that, it had been kind of and this was when the ROTC programs were kind of being held in some pretty dim light, and the PMS prior to the PMS that I was under, he had put the guys in civilian clothes. They didn't wear their uniforms. Well, in the PMS that I served under, Colonel McIntyre, he said, we're in uniform. We're in the military. We got back into uniform, which I thought was totally right. Now, as a student, I went to school as like, a student would go. Although they figured out earlier on I was older, and they would figure out, I'm military. And a lot of the kids would come up, we had a lot of discussions about it because Vietnam was going on and all this stuff. Because this was in 70. It had just actually ended. This was in 72, 3 time frame. But in any event.
So just as Vietnam is ending.
Just as Vietnam was ending, that was when I went to grad school. Came out of Vietnam, my last tour, to grad school.
I'm curious because, I normally would ask this later, but since we're on it, did any students, you mentioned a lot of them were quite interested in your experiences. What would they ask you? What kind of questions would they?
Well, they just wanted to know what was and I never did really discuss the gory details much with them, but they just wanted to know, how I reacted to the protest back home and things like that. And I said, well, you got to understand. I said, of course, I'm a career soldier, so I was sent there to do a job, and I went there and did the best I could. And I tried to explain to them what we did and some of the things. Of course, I was in special forces, so I was not with the quote mainline units. So that was a little different viewpoint, and they were all interested in that. You worked with the indigenous. I said, oh yeah, we worked with the Montagnards and the Cambods and what we call the CIDG, the Civilian Irregular Defense Group soldiers. So it was not like we were working, with a mainline unit.
You had said you sort of had worked. You'd worked within a regular unit.
So we were not out with the mainline units, but
you were never.
I never felt from the students that I talked with. I never felt any animosity, because Vanderbilt is a fairly conservative campus.
Yeah.
I think if you're familiar with, overall they are.
Yeah, but still, it was a pretty contentious era.
Yeah.
And I think, the reason I asked, because I think, we read a lot about veterans being mistreated, coming home and mistreated, and I'm very curious that you never had an incident in Vanderbilt where someone really...
Not at Vanderbilt. And I think part of that was that the administration, backed ROTC. Of course, they had their naval ROTC at Vanderbilt was probably stronger than the Army ROTC because that's kind of the general background. Interestingly enough, the PMS I had, like I say, we got into uniform, and of course, I had some professors. I had a younger professor at Vanderbilt, Dr. Leffler, that
Mel Leffler?
Mel Leffler.
Oh yes,
You know him?
oh yes. He's had quite a career. He's having,
Yeah.
or he's still having quite a career.
Is he at Vanderbilt now?
No, he's in Virginia. He's a dean, I think now.
Oh, is that right?
Oh no, he's really a hot
Yeah,
commodity.
he was just out of, I think he graduated, I don't know if he got his doctorate at Cornell.
Mhm.
But he was from that part of the country, so to speak. Well, I had and I forget, it was a history course under him. It was a paper I did for him was on the Mexican War, and he chewed me up and spit me out. And we had some pretty good conversations because he was interested, and from the viewpoint of here's a veteran from Vietnam, and we had some real conversations. Very good professor. I enjoyed his classes. He was, and Dr. Grantham.
Otis Graham.
Grantham.
Grantham, yes.
Grantham?
Yeah.
Grantham.
I think
Is
it's
that right? Or is it Graham?
Graham. I'm not sure actually. I know the name. I know who.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was interested, and I had a lot of good courses with him. And he, again, they would, they kind of picked my brain, if you will, and try to, get a perspective from my view, if you will, of what.
So you conveyed the sense that there was a lot of openness. That they were genuinely.
Well, what I was getting ready to say, our PMS, we were wargaming. How are we going to get students in, and how are we going to get although there were some on the faculty, and I never did really get that close into it. They were somewhat anti-military.
Yeah.
I mean, that's going to happen in any situation. So what we decided to do, we divided kind of the faculty. There were 7 or 8 ROTC instructors and so officers. So we each took, 15 to 20 professors. So, okay. And what we were trying to sell to them, and that's, for the want of a better term, what we were trying to educate them to or sell them to, was about the scholarship program, the Army ROTC scholarship program. So we took these 15 to 20 professors, called them, made an appointment, went out, sat in their office, and just presented the ROTC program to them, the scholarship program. Because Vanderbilt, at that point, lived on the scholarship program. Because none of the students in the student body, not that they were violently anti-military, but they weren't there to be an ROTC. So I'd say I don't know what percentage, but the majority, vast majority, were scholarship.
Scholarship. That was the way.
That was it.
That was.
And we got in with the admissions and recruiting, the Vanderbilt recruiting office and admissions office, and presented our programs, and they let us mail out packages to all these kids who were coming to Vanderbilt to show them about ROTC, and more particularly about the scholarship program. So we sat down with all these different professors, and I ended up, I talked to most of the guys in the history department, especially in the history department. But what we found is that once you got one-on-one, face-to-face, and they saw that you weren't a three-headed monster, or, a warmonger and all this, some real rapport started being built up on the campus here at Vanderbilt. And I think that was one of the best things that we did. And this was in the early 70s when things were really in turmoil. And so that really worked to our advantage because a lot of the professors had when we would tell them, this scholarship pays full tuition, books, all this, I think at that time $100 a month maybe, and they were just astounded. They said, well, golly, that's worth, I think at that time, $20,000 a year.
Mm-hmm.
And we said, yeah, this is a good scholarship. And the payback is not that, much, 3 years academia, I think, or 4 maybe. But also, and of course, Vanderbilt being the medical school that it is, there was the military medical scholarship program. And we sold a lot of those. keep using the term sell, but we,
Yeah.
you know, we were able to, and a lot of the kids said, boy, this is, I mean, full ride to medical school, help mom and daddy's pocketbook. Of course, we used to laugh about it. Some of the guys who were on scholarship, who were there at Vanderbilt, were also from affluent families. I mean, it's just part of it. They would drive up to pick up their monthly check, and we literally would have to put out a word. You know, Scotty, come and get your check. Or, you know, we'd have to give them direct messages, come down and pick up your $100 check, whatever it was. And they'd drive up in their little sport car, because, you know, to them, $100 was a good night out, I guess. But, you know, but that was the atmosphere that when I left there, it was...
So you arrived in Vanderbilt, what year? It was 72, 73?
72, I guess. I'm trying to remember when I got out of... No, it's probably 71. Let's see, 71, 72, 73, 74, 75, 71. Because I only stayed there 2 years as an instructor.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got selected to go to Command General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth in 75, I guess. So I was there for about 4 years.
So from 71, so really in that transition period from the Vietnam War winding down to the post-Vietnam.
Yeah.
I'm also, did you know of any Vietnam veterans who were in the Vanderbilt as an undergrad or graduate? Did you encounter any Vietnam vets who were going on the GI Bill that you can remember offhand?
Yeah, there was one or two, and there was a big contingent of active duty students there. Vanderbilt had a program in Portuguese.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what the studies were, but
Yeah.
and these guys were there to get the degree to go teach at the Point. At West
Oh, okay.
Point.
Yes.
So there was a pretty good contingent of quote active duty who were students, and then as far as veterans, actual just students.
Yeah, students. You know, who you might have encountered.
Yeah,
In the
there were. I took a political science course, one of my summer courses, from an English. He was English. Well, I can't remember his name. He was funny. Had a very English wit. You know, very laid back. And that was a summer course. It was about 2 hours or 3 hours a day because it was accelerated, you know, and we had a lot of fun out of it. And he was interesting, and I think there was 2 guys there, but we never really got.
Yeah.
You didn't really swap war stories per se and stuff like that. But no, I don't know if there were that many of that, and they were probably in the different areas in the college or in the university and all. Basically, I just took history course.
Yeah. So you didn't have it. There was no graduate students that were
No.
that had been.
Not that I remember.
I'm curious because some of the professors you had at Vanderbilt were World War II veterans, and I'm just curious. Were there any questioning about comparing different wars? Did that ever come up?
Dr. Borman, who, like I say, had been in the Navy in World War II, and he was more with the Marines, and he was very pro-military. I mean, not that there were any that were very anti-military.
Yeah.
But we would have conversations and discuss. He was kind of my mentor because he was my thesis professor.
Well, and I should ask, what was your thesis on?
I wrote on the, golly, I can't even remember the name of it now, the title of it, but it was on Vo Nguyen Giap, the Vietnamese General Giap.
Mm-hmm.
Basically was his history, a biography. I can't even remember the title of my thesis. That's interesting. It made a real impression on me, didn't it? But it was basically, I think it was the life and wars of Vo Nguyen Giap.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Borman kind of kept me online and kept me going, you know, to keep me going too far out of base. But it was basically a biography of it.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the war had really not ended by the time I finished it.
Yeah, I mean,
73.
yeah.
We pulled out in
we pulled out.
73.
Yeah,
And 75
yeah.
is when it all
Really, yeah.
ended. And I basically, I have an uncle who thought I was just, knew what I was talking about, because he asked me when I came back, or he asked me when we got out of Vietnam in 73, he said, well, how long, or he said, what do you think's going to happen, George? This uncle of mine he was very interested in current events and history and everything else. And I really felt this, and it was not like I knew. I said, I'll tell you what, I said, Uncle Charles is in charge. I said, Uncle Charles, I will be surprised if the South Vietnamese hold on more than 2 to 3 years.
That was your
That was
set.
my assessment. And that was in 73 and 75. And he reminded me of our conversation, and I kind of, he said, you call it right, George. You said 2 to 3 years, and I said, well, there was, the South Vietnamese were just not, passionate enough about unifying their country under their rule.
Mm-hmm.
And the North Vietnamese were. The ones that I work with in the South that were really good, the officers and kind of the groups that I worked with, because I worked with small groups, being Special Forces, and I was the Vietnamese Rangers. They were from the North, and they were good. But across the board, the South Vietnamese.
So they were the exiles that they were the.
So they were, they knew what they were fighting for, if you will. The South Vietnamese, and of course, there was the corruption, there was just the whole malaise, if you will, of the South Vietnamese that when I came away from there, I said, man, we've expended a lot of time and good men, but I just don't think they'll hold on to it. I mean, it's not like I'm sitting here thinking, well, I knew what I was talking about.
Yeah,
that was just.
But that was just that was.
And my Uncle Charles, who's dead now, but he can verify it. Because I told him, I said 2 to 3 years.
It also sounds like, I mean, I was surprised by your thesis topic in some ways, because I thought you would have picked something safe on, the Civil War or something. It sounds like you were also using this master's program to sort of reflect a little on what had been going on in Vietnam,
and of course, the fact that it was kind of biographical, I didn't really get into the tactics per se or the actual fighting of the Vietnam War, because I had to bring him all the way up from where he started out with as a young guy and coming all the way through and fighting the French, and then here he is, he's the guy fighting the battle with the United States. But Dr. Bourne and I we fished around for some topics, and he said, well, he kind of guided me into that, I guess you'd say. Not knowing what kind of resources we would run across.
Well, that was my next question. I mean, what resources were you able to use?
A lot of them were on Bernard Fall had written a lot of the history of the Southeast Asia. I was able to get into some of the writings of Giap and some of his tenets. Of course, Ho Chi Minh, I kind of had to study his background a little bit. So as far as first-hand resource documents, there weren't that many out there. And then, of course, I guess I put a little, that's been 30 years ago, I guess I put a little bit of my experiences in there as to what I reacted to it.
Now, were you able to read Vietnamese, or did you have to work with translations?
As a matter of fact, I went to the language school twice. One time Czech, the second time Vietnamese. But I went to the Vietnamese language school, the Defense Language Institute out of Monterey, between my first and second tours.
Mm-hmm.
So the first tour, when I was working with the Special Forces, I had to go through interpreters, which if you had to deal with an interpreter.
Oh, I can imagine just.
You never know what has been said to them, you don't know what you're getting back, and of course you try to work that out. And one of the things I found out with the Vietnamese, you could not, I never did. I never got a yes or no answer. I would phrase questions that the only way you could answer would be yes or no, and they would not give you a yes or no answer. And I'd tell my interpreter that all I want is yes or no. da, 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 and so once I got the language, then I went back in. I was working with the Rangers, the first counterpart I had in the Rangers was from the north, Chiltah Bao. It was Major Bao. Was part Chinese, I think. Very good officer, and we were able. So he would speak English, and I would speak Vietnamese, and that's how we conversed. And I could get a yes or no out of him and that was one of the first things I told him. I said, Chiltah, which is Major. I said, Major Bao. I've never been able to get a yes or no answer out of one of you people. I said, can I get a yes or no answer? And he said, yes. But he had a good sense of humor, but we got along well. And that was up in the Central Highlands near Pleiku, as they call it. And then I went down, they had a camp down near Ducklop in Ben Matut that just really had some problems. I mean, our team was screwed up. And what we had done, we converted from Special Forces camps, the one, like I had built the first time around and had dealt with, to Ranger battalions. So really you had Special Forces guys going out the door and these Ranger guys coming in. Well, I'm Special Forces, so it was like old home week, But by this time, the Special Forces had really kind of, their mission and the use of them had kind of dwindled away, other than the SOG, the Studies and Observation Groups, they call them. They were still very heavily involved going across the borders, but the Special Forces camps had kind of outlived their usefulness, so they turned them into Ranger battalions. So the first battalion I had, of course, was this Chiltah Bao. Was a good camp. He ran it straight, ran good operations, the whole bit. So as far as advising, I didn't have to do much there. And we were reduced from 12-man Special Forces team to a 4-man Ranger team. So your assets were less, and your ability to get assets was less. But anyway, we had this camp down at Ducklop that was having some real problems, and they threw me in there kind of as a put out a fire type thing, and it was dismal. But the big point, I was able to walk in and talk to my counterpart in Vietnamese.
And that sounds.
And that I took him into an office about half this size, one-on-one, and he was a young captain, and I was a major at that point. Of course, that kind of put a little different thing. I'm senior in rank, and they kind of looked at that. But I just sat him down and told him what we're going to do, and how we're going to do it, and when we're going to do it, like right now. And the first thing I said, we're going to clean this damn hole up. So we're going to get this place cleaned up. We're going to get supplies out to the troops, because they were living in hovels. So it was that kind of thing. And once they saw that I meant what we were talking about, and the soldiers were willing to do this, because I went into the supply room and they had all these uniforms and boots and stuff for them that they hadn't put out to them, and they were walking barefoot. So we started outfitting the troops in new uniforms and shoes and stuff, and they thought this guy's, the second coming of the Messiah. So,
Well, you could also just talk to a soldier. I mean, you didn't.
I didn't have to have an interpreter.
Yeah.
And although some of them were, well, actually, the first camp was predominantly Montagnards.
Yeah.
The mountain people. These were Vietnamese. So I could walk out right into the trench and start conversing with them. Unfortunately, I've lost. I can say a few things in Vietnamese.
But when you were doing your thesis, were you able to use Vietnamese? Were you able to actually? I mean, it's also been a while.
There were some of the sources I could read.
Yeah.
And maybe get a little bit with it, but more of course, the language school, it's more of the verbal.
Verbal. Mm-hmm.
The reading became a little difficult, but and I didn't, get to interview, any.
Yeah.
Direct sources.
Well, I mean, the war's still going on. I mean, this is. Well, I think we should probably break for lunch, because it's
okay,
1 o'clock. Break, and let me. I have some follow-up questions that I keep meaning to ask, but let me have Bob jump in and take over some questioning. Sure. Make sure he gets a chance to.
Yeah, most of my questions are all pretty much related to your tours of duty in Vietnam. I was just wondering, Once you found out you were going to Vietnam, did you have any anticipation of what it was like? And then when you got there, did it turn out to be something totally different than you thought it'd be? Or
Well, of course, I knew when I left Germany I was going to the 5th Special Forces, so I knew I would still be in kind of the same element that I was in Germany. The big difference was, and I knew this going in, is of course our mission in Germany was more of a counterinsurgency. We would be the guerrillas, if you will.
Or the insurgents.
The insurgents, yeah. And of course in Vietnam, our mission was counterinsurgency, trying to fight the guerrillas, which is what Special Forces camps did. But as far as what my assignment was going to be, I knew it was 5th Special Forces. I knew I was a captain. I knew I was a A-team, which is the lowest unit level in SF, Special Forces. But I didn't know I was going to get a team. And what ended up happening is I was assigned to a B team, which is the next level up, as the funds officer. Mm-hmm. And the term is kind of interesting. As the funds officer, we had what we call operational funds that supplied all of our camps and paid all of our troops, and this funneled through me as the funds officer in the B team. And we were talking, I forget, 100,000 piastra, maybe, which is equivalent to, piastra is about equivalent to $1. So it was a big bunch of money.
Yeah.
I had to control and be, dispense and know where it went and what it was for. So I did that for about the first 2 to 3 months, and then I was tabbed to build a Special Forces camp. Mm-hmm. So we were establishing camps all along the Laotian and Cambodian border. So they had an area that was due west of Saigon, right off an area called the Parrot's Beak. And the way if you can see the map, it looks like a parrot's beak sticking out there. And that was a salient into South Vietnam out of Cambodia. Well, the Ho Chi Minh Trail we knew was up north, and the Central Highlands was being used quite frequently and quite effectively, and so it had spread south, so we needed to put some camps along the border to kind of stem that tide, so to speak. And the way they organized this, that you would have a Special Forces camp, and they were about 10 meters or so apart, which was about the effective artillery range of a 105 howitzer. Mm-hmm. So you had overlapping fires, if you will, and you had to try to pick a piece of ground that would lend itself to the camp. Plus, the regular U.S. units in these areas had what they call overwatch of these Special Forces camps. So, for instance, our particular camps had the overwatch by the 25th Infantry Division, which was located at Cu Chi, which is kind of northwest of Saigon. So that was and our B team initially was established in an old French villa, a place called Hepwa. And this French villa, we call it the villa, but this village of Hepwa had a sugar mill. And this area was sugar cane, and the French had developed it, for sugar. And they had an airstrip and the whole bit. So we moved in back, we left an A team there, we built a camp and left an A team in Hepwa, and then the B team moved back to another place called Duckwa. And then they said, okay, we need to build a camp in this general vicinity. Well, I took I was able to pull together a team. I didn't have a Special Forces team at that point, but I was able to go out and recruit guys, some that I knew from Germany, some that I knew from Fort Bragg. So I kind of pulled together a team. And so we went out and did what we call a ground assessment, on-the-ground assessment, and went into the area and figured out where we felt like the camp ought to be established. And then at that point we started the planning, what the camp was going to look like, getting the materials in to build the camp. And then I sent some of my guys out to recruit the local indigenous forces, what we call the Civilian Irregular Defense Group, to recruit these guys who were like a militia, really, or a National Guard, a little bit lower than a National Guard. But in any event, recruited these guys, and we sent them we had a training camp in a place called Trang Sup, which was secured, and We bring them in there and teach them weapons and, basic military tactics and stuff. And then, in the meantime, we were getting all the supplies and everything marshaled in one area at Duquois to go in and build a camp. And basically how it had ended up being is that we made a heliborne assault, put our feet on the ground, started filling sandbags to make bunkers, and started bringing in supplies. And started building the camp, literally cutting down trees and laying out the barbed wire and concertina wire. And we had an engineer team with us, what they call a KB team. KB, I don't remember what that acronym meant, but they were actually engineers. It was a captain and 3 enlisted guys with him. And they kind of designed the camp and made sure we did things, built the camp. The problem we had where we were going into a little place called Lumois, which was a village. It was near that village. It wasn't right in that village, but it was a village that was established by a Catholic priest who had come south out of North Vietnam in 1954 when the French, pulled out and they divided North and South Vietnam, and these people came south. So he brought his flock, so to speak, down to a little place called Lumois. And this area was a pineapple growing area. And there were, where I built my camp, there were rows of pineapple fields, and still growing. Some, of course, it was in the wild. But in any event, we went in, and that was kind of the highest piece of ground. There had been at one time an old French villa, I call them villas, French house, had been built right on this canal that the French had dug that went straight into Saigon. But through the ensuing years, the bridge had been dropped, so it was no longer useful, and the road was, of course, kind of dissipated away. But we were on this canal, and it was kind of gave us a little bit of transportation. We could go up and down the canal in our boats. But the little village of Lumois, we were about 2 kilometers south of it. So they were glad to see us come in because it gave them some security. So we basically started building the camp, and in about a month's time, we had the walls up, the hooches built, the mortar pits in, and everything else. And of course, all while this was going on, we had brought our troops in and had been trained, these civilian irregular defense group, soldiers, if you will, Vietnamese soldiers, and families. That was not part of the bargain, but that's how they did it over there. So we brought them all in, and then we started running operations, and basically kind of being a tripwire, if you will, of supplies coming in through out of Cambodia through this area into the Saigon area. Well, this was in the spring, May of '67, and to set it in a historical perspective, this same time frame in June of '67, we had the 6-day war in Israel. The Israeli 6-day war, and we went in right before that kicked off, and the first Stars and Stripes, which is the Army's newspaper, we get the Stars and Stripes out there about 2 weeks later, and this war has come and gone. And we're sitting there, well, the enemy Israeli kick some butt over there. And of course, we were out there in the middle of our own little, thing going on. So we built the camp and operated at the same time. We just kind of kept our security out primarily. So this was in the spring of '67. Well, toward the summer, toward the fall, of course, I was getting ready to leave. I'd already had my year's tour up in September. We noticed they would avoid contact. We'd go on operations, and they would break contact, and just didn't really want to fight that much. And later on, looking back on it, what we felt was happening, they were trying to reposition their supplies around the Saigon area for Tet of '68.
And these are the irregulars, or these are
the Viet Cong primarily. We never did run into any North Vietnamese. We were strictly the local Viet Cong type units. But we did, we interdicted them to a large degree because we would find a cache of weapons, or we found we call it a munitions plant, but it was pretty unsophisticated, but they were making rifle grenades, they were reloading their ammunition, and it was so camouflaged. If you flew over it, and we tried to go back, believe it or not, with a helicopter, and it took us forever to find it again from the air.
Mhm.
But we, of course, we had an operation, ran into it, and it was all under canopy, and it was also all their huts and everything had, the regular foliage on top of it, and you literally couldn't see it from the air. And they didn't have they didn't make any trails or anything like that you could pick out and see. We finally kind of resectioned and said, okay, we were here, we know we were here, and we kind of came down on it and got it from a helicopter. But the operations, we kept, when we ran operations, usually 2 Americans would go with a company, for instance, of about 100 or so of the CIDG. And that's basically how we ran our operations. We turned up a good bit of stuff. We had one incident. We had one of our, to build a camp, the way that the area was the water table was such that you couldn't dig in. You couldn't dig a bunker per se, 7 feet underground like a lot of the camps did up in Central Highlands. So we basically came out, and this was where the engineer team came in. We came in with an idea, or they came up with an idea, to use Conex containers.
Oh yeah, I read that in your book. Yeah.
Which is the metal containers they ship supplies in.
Mm-hmm.
So we rigged those things up as machine gun bunkers, and we could put them down maybe 2 to 3 feet down in the ground. That was as deep as you could go, or you'd have water in it.
Yep.
And then we sandbagged them, capped them over with concrete, and I've got some slides. They look like the Maginot Line in France, for World War II time period. But in any event, we had these Conex containers, firing ports and everything, periodically all around the perimeter of the wall of the camp. So we were doing all that while we were running operations. But one of the things that we ran into, General Westmoreland came out to the camp. And of course he had all of his, as I call them, horse holders with him.
Mm-hmm.
That's the old term from Civil War time frame, I think. Dr. Peeler knows what I'm talking about. They had choppers flying around, secure, and he was flying all around. But then he was giving you the briefing. And I said, he said, if there's anything you need, Captain, so we'll try to help you out here. So we've been on the ground maybe 2 weeks at the time. We're making good progress. And I said, well, one of the problems we've got is that we had requested sand to make the concrete, or the cement, the concrete, to cap our bunkers. And I said, we haven't been able to get that sand in here. And he looks over his shoulder to some colonel, and says, well, check on this sand for Lingua. So we need to know where it is. Well, what had happened, they had loaded a barge of sand down in Saigon, and they were trying to figure out how to get it to us. Of course, there was a river, the Songkovan River, a river coming up out of Saigon area, and we could go down our canal that we were located right next to the canal. So in any event, they bring this barge of sand up, big, not an ocean-going barge, a cricket-sized barge. And we had cut down the palm trees along the edge of the canal there, and we tied, thought we had them all tied in, secured. Well, the tide came in and out. We were affected by the tide. It would come up 3 to 4 feet when it came in, it'd float up and then it'd go down. Well, one night, the tide goes out, and it pulled the barge loose. And it floated down the canal, and we didn't know where the hell it gone. Because the guards came up, waking us up. So the barge is gone, the barge is gone. Oh, man, it's pitch black, middle of the night, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. So I called back in. I said, at first light, I want a bird dog down here, which is an observation plane. I said, we need a bird dog down here to see where our barge is. We've lost our sand barge. Well, of course, this report gets all the way up to the C team, which is back in the train. And I had a good friend up there. We laughed about it in later years because we were served together. And he said, yeah, well, I remember the night the damn message came in about, they've lost a sand barge at Lungwa. Well, he knew where I was. He said, that's damn Massey down there. What's he doing now? So the next morning, the bird dog comes over. Now, you talking about the small world. This guy comes over, and he flips his wings at us, and this is bird dog 3 or whatever. And I said, this is Ugly Ambush 6, because that was my call sign. I said, we got a sand barge. It's broke loose last night. We don't know where it is. And he wheels over. Wasn't that far? He said, hey, I got it in sight. He said, it's out in the middle of the river. And the tide was coming back in. He said, it's floating back. I said, you got to be kidding me. So we had some engineer boats, 16-foot engineer boats with 40 horsepower motors. So we go roaring off down the. Let me back up. During the night, we jumped in our boats to see if we could see the barge. Well, we got down in the river, and we're going along the river, and all of a sudden, here's a bunch of sampans going across the river in front of us, and it's a VC taking supplies across the river in the middle of the night. And we had this meeting engagement, and I had a sergeant with me on the bow of the boat. He had an M79, which is a grenade launcher. It's a 20 millimeter. And he goes, boom! He shoots one of the barges, and one of the sampans. Shit's blasting, and you lose your night vision. And I said, man, I don't know what we've run into, but there wasn't but 4 of us in this boat, and we turned that thing around, went back to camp, firing all the way, to lay down a base fire. So we had run into a supply outfit going across the river. So that happened that night before we, I got out of line there. But in any event, the next morning the bird dog gets up and he said, yeah, I see it coming up the river. So we jumped back in our boats, go back down. And of course, it was all secure. We tied into it and very gingerly pulled that barge all the way back into camp. Well, if I mentioned earlier, there was a bridge, had been a bridge across this canal, had been dropped down in the canal. Times past had blown it up. Mm-hmm. So we lashed into that bridge. I said, if this thing goes out, it's got a big anchor it's got to take with it. So that's how we secured our barge. But anyway, we were able to unload it, and they said, well, how are we going to unload this sand? And we tried pulleys, we tried all kinds of different ways we did it. Finally, we ended up filling sandbags and carrying them one at a time across a ramp to the camp. And we got our civilian irregular defense group coolies to carry sand over there, and we were able to use it. And we had brought in a small concrete mixer by helicopter, and we were able to mix our concrete, and there we went. So we ended up building the camp. So that was my first tour, and like I say, then by the time we got the camp built, we were complete, and my tour of duty kind of ended. Yep. So that was so far as knowing what I was going to do, I had no idea, and I ended up building it, which was really kind of a unique experience because there were only so many camps built, and I got to build one.
Yeah, I think I was reading like 270 throughout all of Vietnam or something.
Through the years, of course, they.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and they eventually ended up primarily along the Cambodian and Laotian border. Yeah, so I got to build one of them. It did not eventually, and not too far after I left Vietnam, they turned my camp over to a Ranger battalion and let them use it as a base of operations. So the SF, the Special Forces portion, left there, but they moved in there the next year because I ran into a Vietnamese colonel that I worked with the first time. And the second time over, when I was in the Ranger Command, he was in the Ranger Command. Uh-huh. And we remembered each other, and he said, oh, yeah, you had to camp at Lung Hoa, and he said the Rangers moved in, so he told me a little bit. Because I never did get back down to it again. I never did see it again, because I was up in the Central Highlands and never got back to it. But it was interesting where our camp was built. At night, looking due east, we could see the flares that they dropped around Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base, or the airfield airport in Saigon, and they dropped flares all night long as part of the security. Uh-huh. And we could see those flares going. We were that close, but we were that far away because it was strictly the only way in was by the water or by helicopter. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of an interesting thing. But overall, our overall operations, we kicked up a good bit. We lost a lot of people to. I should have brought one. I just didn't think about it. CBU booby traps. I
was going to ask you about booby traps.
Yeah. Down in the area where we were located, the Air Force used the cluster bomb unit, CBU. These things were mounted on a pod, and they came out, I think, 250 to a pod, and they were fin stabilized. So the fins would flip open, and it would come down, head down, and it made a good weapon to prep landing zones, or if you caught units in the open. They made real good weapons. But the area where we were located was so wet It was in the northern part of the Plain of Reeds, which was basically a big swamp. It had a high dud rate. I mean, they would hit the water and not go off.
Mm-hmm.
So the Viet Cong would take these things and make them into booby traps, and they were ingenious. Like I say, I've got one at home. I brought it home with me. So we consequently, and that was part of that, munitions factory I was telling you about. That was part of the big part of what they were doing, was changing these CBU cluster bomb things into booby traps.
Yep.
And they actually would turn the fin around, which was a spring activated fin, and they would rig those things up so that, and they'd make a little striker. And it's kind of hard to describe this thing without having it in front of me, but it was a kind of a series of little explosions that finally would blow this thing up. They had a little blasting cap and a little larger piece of explosive, and then the base itself was about big as the palm of your hand, and it had ball bearings in it. It was a pig iron type thing, and these ball bearings would blow up because it had TNT in the middle of it, and it would shoot out in shrapnel. It was a very effective weapon, really, and in a booby trap especially. So they would put these things, and that's why you never, it was not an unwritten rule, it was a rule. You do not use the same trail in and out, and you vary the trails that you use, and you really don't walk on the tops of rice dikes or anything like that, or anywhere that normally people would walk. You just don't do that, because they would booby trap.
Yep.
And they would set them at the base of the trees, and they used fish line to tie them off, and you'd trip the tripwire, and boom, they would go off. Well, and this may sound callous, but we had what we call our booby trap trippers. We had the civilian irregular defense group points out, and unfortunately, we had over 100 casualties, and I'd say 99% of them were to the booby traps.
Wow.
We had contact, we had firefights, but the majority of our casualties were to these booby traps. Because what would happen, you'd get into a firefight sometimes, and if you were trying to maneuver, they would have had these things set out. So it was so what we ended up doing in our area, if we called for airstrikes from the Air Force, we would ask through the bird dogs, the forward air controller, we'd say, what's their ordnance? And they'd say, well, we got napalm, we got 500 pounds, whatever, we got CBUs. And he said, we'll take everything but the CBUs. Do not drop the CBUs here.
Yeah.
Well, when Westmoreland came out on his visit, I had one up, and I showed it to him, and showed him how I had it rigged up. And it was kind of interesting. He said, well, this is what we need to check into. I mean, he talked to somebody else. He said, can I have this? I said, yes, sir, it's yours. If you want it, 4 stars looking at you. You can have whatever you want, I said, yes, sir, that's yours. So he took it with him. Well, about a week or so later, another 2-star general, I guess, was on his staff. I think it was the S2, G2, came out, General, I can't remember his name, a big tall guy, but he came out, and I gave him the same briefing. I showed where we were operating, and I showed him the CBU and what our casualties, explained the whole thing to him. He said, well, that's interesting. So General Westmoreland's got one of those on his desk. I said, well, okay. He took it back with him. So that's kind of an interesting little sidelight there. But what I started to say earlier on, this bird dog pilot that came over and found our barge floating up the river, he landed back at Duckwaw, which is where our B team was, and to refuel. So he goes over to the B team, and he said, well, now, who is this guy down, what camp did I fly over? And they said, well, that's Lumois. Said, yeah, Captain Massey has the camp. And he said, is that George Massey? This guy and I were classmates here at UT, Passmore, and he was a pilot.
Wow.
Army bird dog pilot. And he said, well, golly, I went to school with that guy. So he came back over and got on the radio with me, and said, of course, he couldn't give names and everything. He said, hey, we're old Big Orange fans, or not that time Big Orange. He said, we're big volunteer fans. And I said, yeah, okay. And he said, talk to the guys back at the rear. They'll tell you who I am. So he was based somewhere else and just happened to get the mission to come out. So, here you got 2, UT guys talking to each other and didn't even know it. But we were in class
Other ends
together.
of the world.
Yeah, we were in class together. But,
Did you ever have any problems with when you go get regular soldiers, like any of them being BC, that would come into the camp and then kind of like, like kind of like double agent kind of thing?
No.
No idea.
Now, that is interesting. We had, when I was at the B team, we were staging to build or to put out A teams. And one of the companies we felt was VC controlled. And of course we got that through the intel from some of the people in the camps, the other Vietnamese. So we packed them up and sent them home. But as far as getting in and doing any kind of, quote, terrorist activities, we never did have that problem. But the Cambodians I had were very interesting how they meted out their discipline. If they got someone, a thief, for instance, and we unfortunately had that happen at times during the camp, they would shave the guy's head and run him out of camp. I mean, just, you out of camp.
Sort of like the old army.
Oh yeah, you're drummed out of the corps. And of course, what that did for the Cambodian, I mean, he's got a shaved head. They knew, hey, this guy's the thief. So he had a hard road to hoe for a long time till his hair grew back out.
Yep.
We had another incident, and like I say, their discipline was pretty tough. We had a young soldier got drunk, and he fired his weapon up in the air. And we heard it go off. He had a carbine. We outfitted our guys with World War II type weapons initially, and this was a M2 carbine, which is automatic. We heard that thing go off. I said, what the hell is that going on down the lower end of the camp? Well, in about 30 minutes, here's a soldier, Cambodian, one of our civilian, irregular defense group guys, comes walking up, and his arm looked like a snake. I mean, it was bent about 4 different directions. And the commander of this guy had taken his arm and had broken it with a stick in about 4 places. And that was his discipline. You don't get drunk and fire your weapon up in the air.
Wow.
So we had to, our medics had to set this arm, and we medevaced him. We sent him back to the Coochie Hospital. The 25th Infantry Division, like I say, was overwatch for us. And if we got real serious contact, and anytime we